Imagine this. You walk into a room and see someone you love slumped over lifeless. Their skin is pale, their breathing has stopped, and next to them, a bottle of antifreeze sits half empty on the nightstand. Your heart pounds, your mind races. Would your first thought be suicide, or would something about the scene feel off? That's exactly what played out in a quiet home in Syracuse, New York, when Stacey Castor called 911, claiming her husband, David Castor, had locked himself in their bedroom and refused to come out. She told the dispatcher that she hadn't seen David in almost a full day, that they had fought, that he had been acting strangely. And now, when she finally checked on him, she had found his cold, unresponsive body. He drank antifreeze, she told police, her voice trembling. At first glance, it looked like a devastating loss, a husband's sudden, tragic end. But if you looked closer, there were signs that something wasn't right. Because David Castor wasn't the first husband Stacey had lost under strange circumstances. And he wouldn't be the last victim in her twisted story. When detectives arrived, they found a carefully staged scene. David Castor's body was sprawled on the bed, his skin tinged with an unusual shade of gray. Next to him, a bottle of bright green toxin antifreeze was open with a half-empty glass beside it. Stacey, with red, teary eyes, gave them her version of what happened. She claimed she and David had argued the day before. He had stormed into their bedroom, slamming the door behind him. She said she didn't want to disturb him, so she left him alone for nearly an entire day. When she finally went to check on him, she found a nightmare. David wasn't breathing. The room reeked of a faint chemical sweetness, and on the table evidence of what she claimed was his suicide. But let's pause for a second. Think about this. How many people choose antifreeze as a way to end their lives? If you've never looked into it, antifreeze poisoning is brutal. It causes excruciating pain, vomiting, kidney failure, and eventually death. It's not quick and it's not painless. And David, he was a grown man, a mechanic, someone who had access to tools, knowledge, and other, much faster methods of taking his own life. So why antifreeze? Why would he choose such a slow, agonizing death? Detectives weren't buying it, and when the coroner got a closer look, the truth began to surface. Here's something chilling about antifreeze poisoning. It leaves behind a signature, a deadly footprint. The key ingredient in antifreeze, ethylene glycol, doesn't just shut down the body, it crystallizes in the kidneys, forming sharp, needle-like deposits. And when the coroner opened up David Castor's body, he found those unmistakable microscopic crystals embedded deep inside his organs. But that wasn't all. Something about David's body position didn't make sense. He was found lying perfectly still, his arms at his sides. No struggle, no convulsions. But antifreeze poisoning isn't peaceful. It causes agonizing pain, vomiting, and uncontrollable spasms. So why didn't his body show signs of distress? And then there was the glass. Inside the glass that supposedly held the poison, investigators found Stacey Castor's fingerprints on the bottom, which meant one of two things. Either David had wiped his own fingerprints off the glass before dying, which makes no sense, or someone else had placed it there after he was already gone. And now detectives were asking the one question that Stacey Castor had never expected. What if this wasn't a suicide? What if this was murder? David Castor's death was suspicious. That much was clear. But as detectives began digging deeper into his widow's past, they stumbled upon something far more chilling. David wasn't the first husband Stacey had lost under strange circumstances. Her first husband, Michael Wallace, had died nearly 5 years earlier in the winter of 2000. Back then, his death had been written off as a heart attack, a natural cause, no investigation, no suspicions, just a tragedy that left Stacey as a grieving single mother to their two daughters, Ashley and Bree. But now, detectives had a reason to question everything. Think about it. What are the chances that two healthy men, both married to the same woman, would die mysteriously years apart from completely unexplained conditions? Detectives knew one thing: lightning doesn't strike twice. And if Stacey had murdered one husband, what were the odds that she had done it before? There was only one way to find out. They needed to dig up the past literally. It had been years since he was buried, but in cases like this, the dead can still speak. And when forensic pathologists conducted their examination, the results sent a shockwave through the entire investigation. Just like David Castor, Michael Wallace's body contained lethal amounts of antifreeze. But here's the terrifying part: Michael's death hadn't been sudden. His medical records told a story of months of sickness. Before he died, he had been experiencing mysterious symptoms: slurred speech, dizziness, nausea, severe pain. Doctors at the time thought he had some sort of viral illness or a neurological disorder. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, investigators saw the real cause. Michael Wallace had been slowly poisoned over time. It wasn't a one-time event, it was a prolonged, calculated murder. And who had been by his side every step of the way? Stacey Castor. Think about how insidious this crime was. Stacey didn't just kill Michael Wallace. She watched him suffer for months. She let him waste away. And when he finally died, she played the role of the grieving widow perfectly. She buried him. She moved on. She remarried. She thought she had pulled off the perfect crime. And for a while, she did. Because let's be honest, antifreeze is the perfect murder weapon. It's easy to get. It's colorful and sweet tasting, making it easy to disguise in drinks. And back then, testing for antifreeze poisoning wasn't standard in autopsies. No one suspected a thing until she got greedy. Because Stacey made the biggest mistake a killer can make. She did it again. And this time, she wasn't going to get away with it. Detectives weren't just looking at one suspicious death anymore. They were looking at two. And that's when the cracks in Stacey's story started to show. Why do people kill? Love, jealousy, revenge, those are common motives. But if we're being honest, money is one of the biggest reasons people are willing to take a life. And Stacey Castor, she stood to gain. When her first husband, Michael Wallace, died, she cashed in on his life insurance payout. That money helped her stay afloat, raise her daughters, and eventually marry David Castor. And when David died under suspicious circumstances, what did Stacey do? She immediately tried to take control of his assets. She pushed hard for the inheritance, property, and financial accounts that had belonged to David. Now, let's think about this for a second. Does this sound like the behavior of a grieving widow? Or does it sound like someone who had been planning this all along? The pieces were starting to fall into place. Michael Wallace dies mysteriously. Stacey collects his life insurance. David Castor dies mysteriously. Stacey moves to claim his assets. And now, detectives have proof that both men were poisoned. By this point, investigators were closing in. The case against Stacey Castor was getting stronger by the day. And that's when she did something truly unthinkable. Something that no mother should ever be capable of. She tried to frame her own daughter for murder. Imagine this. You're a teenager who just lost your father. Your stepfather dies mysteriously. Police are everywhere. Questions swirl. And then suddenly you wake up in a hospital bed, barely alive. That's what happened to Ashley Wallace, and the person responsible, her own mother. By this point, Stacey knew she was in serious trouble. She could feel the walls closing in. Her story was falling apart. The truth was coming out. So she made a last-ditch effort to save herself. She tried to make it look like her own daughter had been the killer all along. One night, Stacey brought Ashley a drink, a simple cocktail, nothing out of the ordinary, or so Ashley thought. But what she didn't know was that the drink was laced with a lethal dose of crushed pills. Hours later, Ashley was found unconscious, overdosed, and near death. Beside her, a suicide note. And this wasn't just any note. It was a full confession. In the letter, Ashley admitted to murdering both of her fathers, Michael Wallace and David Castor. The message was clear. Stacey wanted the world to believe that Ashley had killed them, been overcome with guilt, and taken her own life. But there was one big problem: a confession note. To the untrained eye, it looked perfect, a neat, handwritten letter spelling out a full admission of guilt. According to the note, Ashley Wallace had murdered both Michael Wallace and David Castor. And now, overcome with guilt, she had taken a lethal dose of drugs to end her own life. It was Stacey Castor's perfect cover-up, or so she thought, because there was one fatal flaw. Ashley hadn't written the note. Forensic experts were called in to examine the handwriting. They compared it to Ashley's school assignments, letters, even her signature, and after a detailed analysis, the truth became impossible to ignore. The handwriting didn't match. In fact, it bore a much closer resemblance to Stacey's own handwriting. Let that sink in for a moment. Detectives weren't just dealing with a murderer, they were dealing with someone who had planned to frame their own child. A mother willing to let her daughter take the fall for 2 murders she committed. And if Ashley hadn't survived, she would have succeeded. But fate had other plans. Somehow, Ashley Wallace survived. Doctors managed to stabilize her just in time. She was rushed to the hospital, given immediate medical attention, and after hours of uncertainty, she woke up. And when she did, her story shattered Stacey's lies. Ashley was horrified when she learned what had happened. She had no idea she had been poisoned, no memory of writing a suicide note, and most importantly, she had absolutely nothing to do with the deaths of her father and stepfather. But as detectives pressed her for answers, she started remembering things. The odd-tasting drink her mother had given her the night before. The way Stacey had insisted she drink all of it. The sudden feeling of dizziness, nausea, and exhaustion before blacking out completely. And now, investigators had something they never expected: a living witness. Ashley Wallace had escaped death and lived to tell the truth. And the more investigators dug, the clearer it became Stacey Castor was running out of ways to escape. There was only one place left for her to go: the courtroom. The case against Stacey Castor was airtight. She had poisoned 2 husbands. She had tried to kill her own daughter. She had forged a suicide note to frame Ashley for her crimes. And now, she was finally going to face justice. When the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time painting a terrifying picture of who Stacey Castor really was. They didn't call her a grieving widow. They didn't call her a loving mother. They called her a cold-blooded, methodical killer. A woman who had fed antifreeze to not one, but 2 husbands, watching them suffer, pretending to care, all while planning her next move. A woman who, when cornered, saw no problem sacrificing her own child to save herself. But would the jury believe it? Would they see Stacey Castor for who she really was? Or would her final act of deception somehow set her free? The courtroom was silent. All eyes were on Ashley Wallace as she took the stand. She had survived her mother's attempt to kill her. She had been framed for 2 murders she didn't commit, And now she was about to do something no child should ever have to do, testify against her own mother in court. Sitting just feet away from her was Stacey Castor, the woman who had brought her into the world and then tried to take her out of it. Can you imagine that? Staring at the person who gave you life, knowing they tried to end yours. Ashley's voice trembled as she recalled the nightmare she had lived through. How her father, Michael Wallace, had become mysteriously ill before dying when she was just a child. How her stepfather, David Castor, had allegedly killed himself with antifreeze, a story that never made sense. And then the night she almost died. She described the drink her mother had given her, the unexplained dizziness, the overwhelming sense of fatigue before she blacked out. She recounted waking up in a hospital bed, being told about the suicide note, a note she never wrote. The jury listened, captivated. But what sealed Stacey's fate wasn't just Ashley's words. It was the evidence, and the prosecution had plenty of it. If there was any doubt left, forensic evidence crushed it. One by one, the experts took the stand, each delivering another nail in Stacey Castor's coffin. Handwriting analysts confirmed that the suicide note was a forgery written in Stacey's own hand. Toxicology reports proved that both Michael Wallace and David Castor had lethal amounts of ethylene glycol in their systems. Medical experts explained that David Castor's body showed no signs of self-inflicted poisoning, no signs of struggling to drink the antifreeze. Someone else had to have administered it. But there was one detail that stood out above everything else. One small mistake that blew Stacey's entire plan apart. The glass of antifreeze found near David Castor's body. It had only Stacey's fingerprints on it, not David's, not even partial prints. If David had really taken his own life, his fingerprints should have been on that glass. But they weren't, because he never picked it up. Someone else had poured it. Someone else had forced it down his throat. And there was only one person who could have done that: Stacey Castor. At that moment, the jury didn't just see a widow. They saw a killer, and now they had to decide her fate. After days of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution had laid out a clear, methodical pattern. Stacey Castor had poisoned her first husband, gotten away with it, then done the exact same thing again. And when she realized police were closing in, she had framed her own daughter, nearly killing her in the process. But still, she never admitted guilt. Even as she sat in that courtroom, facing the mountain of proof against her, she maintained her innocence. Would the jury believe her? Would she somehow slip through the cracks again? After several hours of deliberation, they returned with their decision. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Stacey Castor was convicted of murder in the second degree, attempted murder, and forgery. For the first time in years, justice had caught up with her. But the story wasn't over yet, because even after her conviction, there was still one question left unanswered. What would happen to her next? The verdict was in. Guilty on all charges. And now it was time for the judge to decide how long Stacey Castor would pay for her crimes. When she stood before the court for sentencing, she didn't break down. She didn't beg for mercy. She didn't even show remorse. Instead, she kept her cold, detached demeanor, the same one she had carried throughout the entire trial. But if she thought she could manipulate her way out of this one, she was dead wrong. The judge didn't hold back. For the murder of David Castor, the attempted murder of Ashley Wallace, and the forgery of the suicide note, Stacey was sentenced to 51 years to life in prison. That meant she wouldn't be eligible for parole until she was well into her 90s, if she even lived that long. The so-called grieving widow would spend the rest of her days behind bars. justice had finally been served. Or had it? Because even in prison, Stacey Castor refused to admit the truth. Even after she was convicted, after the forensic evidence, after Ashley's heartbreaking testimony, after the jury sealed her fate, Stacey Castor never confessed. Not once. She sat in prison for years, maintaining her innocence, telling anyone who would listen that she had been wrongfully accused. She never apologized to Ashley. She never acknowledged what she had done to her husbands. She stuck to her story, pretending to be the victim until the very end. But there was one thing she couldn't escape: time. And eventually it caught up with her. Years after her conviction, Stacey Castor was found dead inside her prison cell. The woman who had poisoned 2 husbands, tried to frame her own daughter, and fooled so many people for so long was gone. She was found unresponsive at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, where she had been serving her life sentence. An autopsy later determined that her cause of death was a heart attack. But here's the strange part. To this day, there are questions about what really happened in those final moments. Some believe that karma finally caught up with her, that after destroying so many lives, her own body turned against her. But others have wondered, did she know her time was running out? Was there something she was hiding? Was it really just natural causes, or could there have been one last dark twist in the Stacey Castor story? What do you think? Stacey Castor spent years poisoning the people closest to her, lying, manipulating, covering up her crimes. And in the end, she died without ever facing the full weight of what she had done. But the scars she left behind, they will never fully heal. Ashley Wallace, the daughter she tried to kill, was the one left to pick up the pieces. And today, we're left with one final question. Did Stacey Castor believe she would get away with it all? Or in those final days, sitting alone in a prison cell, did she finally realize the truth that in the end, no matter how well you plan, you can't outrun justice forever? What kind of person poisons their own family? Not in a fit of rage, not in an act of self-defense, but slowly, methodically, over time. Was Stacey Castor always like this? Or did something trigger her descent into darkness? She wasn't someone who killed in a moment of passion. She planned, she manipulated, she watched her husband suffer day after day, pretending to care while secretly feeding them more poison. And when she was about to be exposed, she did the unthinkable. She tried to erase her own daughter to cover her tracks. What does that say about her? Was she a calculated sociopath who was always capable of this? Or was there something in her past, something we'll never know, that turned her into the monster she became? And here's the most disturbing question of all. How many more victims could there have been? We know about Michael Wallace. We know about David Castor. We know about Ashley Wallace, the daughter who barely survived. But what if there were others? What if she experimented with smaller doses on people in her life? What if she had planned more murders that she never got the chance to carry out? The terrifying reality is, we may never know. Stacey Castor thought she was smarter than everyone else. She thought she could fool detectives, the jury, even her own daughter. For years, she got away with it. She cried on television. She played the grieving widow. She put on a flawless act. And for a while, it worked. But in the end, there's one thing even the most careful killers can't escape: the truth. It took years. It took a determined police force, a daughter who survived, a jury that saw through the lies. But in the end, the truth always comes out. Now, I'll leave you with this. If someone close to you suddenly died under mysterious circumstances, would you question it? Or would you accept the story you were given? Because here's the thing about killers like Stacey Castor. They don't look like monsters. They look like loving wives, caring mothers, devoted friends. And that's what makes them so dangerous. Because maybe, just maybe, someone somewhere is getting away with murder, and no one has noticed yet.